Probing, the testing will continue from Hamas, Hezbollah. Basically, all of the Iranian regime's proxies now smell blood. They see a new government. They see a shaky coalition which could fall apart if there is an ideological clash. Remember, left-wing, right-wing, centrist, and even an Islamist party, all part of this new coalition, 8 parties in all. So again, you will see Israel's enemies, I believe, testing and probing and seeing and looking for signs of weakness in this new government.
With this delicate ceasefire now in place, the state of Israel has a new government. Benjamin Netanyahu has been ousted from power, and now we see a coalition of parties, right, left, centrist parties, even an Islamic party, is part of this delicate coalition that is now ruling in the state of Israel. And now the current prime minister is going to rule for about 2 years. Then the leader of the other party is going to come in and rule for the next 2 years until the next national elections. And already the enemies of Israel are testing this coalition. They are probing, they are testing it to see where its weaknesses are. And this is a very delicate coalition that could disintegrate at any time. So the enemies of Israel are taking advantage. And of course, the hand behind it all is, of course, Iran. Iran is pulling the strings. Iran is funding Hamas and Hezbollah with weapons and money and food, as it says here in this article by Stephen Collins. During this conflict, before the ceasefire, he writes, Iran's hand in this conflict is obvious. A spokesman in Gaza says weapons, money, food are provided by Iran, and that they have an endless supply of Iranian rockets to use against Israel. And then it says here that the mainstream media is not covering this part of the conflict. He says that some rocket attacks have originated in Lebanon, and that these rockets landed in the sea along the Israeli coast. This indicates that Hezbollah, an Iranian ally, which controls southern Lebanon, must have been authorized by Iran to fire some of its reported 100,000 rockets and missiles at Israel as well. So obviously Iran is behind it all. And of course, the whole goal of this, as it says here, Iran has publicly declared its intent to wipe Israel off the map. That is the goal. And we also see fighting within Israel itself. And it says here that the fighting is not only between Israeli and Hamas forces in Gaza. Street fighting has also broken out within Israel's borders between Jews and Palestinians living inside of Israel. This internal fighting within Israel is a new development in the history of the Hamas-Israeli conflicts, and this internal fighting definitely serves Iran's goals to weaken Israel from within. And that is the whole point of all of this, is to weaken Israel to the point where they can come in and just wipe Israel off the map. Now notice what Iran was doing here during this conflict. It says Iran surely supplied Hamas with so many rockets because it wants to test the Israeli Iron Dome system to see how many rockets it will take to overwhelm it. Even if they can't overwhelm it with Hamas rockets, the Iranians are forcing Israel to expend a lot of its Iron Dome projectiles to knock down Hamas rockets. This weakens Israel. Again, that's what they want to do, weaken Israel. So it can be more easily overwhelmed by a truly massive rocket missile attack from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Undoubtedly, the Israelis realize this too, and they have to be counting their Iron Dome system's ammo to see how much more they can expend in a prolonged engagement with Hamas. So this is the reason for this conflict, to weaken Israel, weaken it to the point where the Iranians can just come in, fire hundreds of thousands of rockets in Israel and destroy Israel and wipe it off the map. That is the goal. Now, right now, we're in a delicate ceasefire. We have a new government. Now, how long is this ceasefire going to last? Already, there's been skirmishes already across the border. And how long is this government going to last with this delicate coalition in place? And what does Bible prophecy have to say about the house of Judah and their future? Well, before I get into some of these biblical prophecies, I want to offer you this free booklet, The Palestinians in Bible Prophecy, and an article I just wrote called Judah Shall Be Broken. Free of charge off our website, britishisrael.ca. And of course, we will put the links underneath the YouTube player, and you can download it directly from there. Take a look at this, and I'll be right back.
King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that troubled him, and Daniel the prophet came to explain what that dream meant. At first he saw a head of gold, and that was the Chaldean Empire, his empire. After that came the arms of silver, and that was the Persian Empire. After that empire came the torso of brass, and that was the Greco-Macedonian Empire. And after that empire came the two legs of iron, and that was the Roman Empire. After this came the part potter's clay and part iron, which is NATO and the EU in our modern day. And then the iron mixed with miry clay. That is the last resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire that will fight Christ at his coming. For more details, log on to our website at britishisrael.ca and download your free booklet, What is the Beast of Revelation? Free of charge off our website, britishisrael.ca.
Biblical prophecies show that the state of Israel is going to be weakened to the point where the king of the north that we read of in Daniel the 11th chapter has to come in and occupy the state of Israel to save it from her enemies. And biblical prophecies show that the enemies come from the east and the north. Now, if you read our booklet, The Middle Eastern Prophecy, we go through with you in Daniel, the 11th chapter, we go through with you that whole prophecy, which is the longest prophecy in the Bible, and we show you who exactly is the king of the north. Now, in Daniel, the 2nd chapter, we see the prophecy of the image in the plain, where Daniel saw a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, a torso of brass, and the legs of iron. And all biblical commentaries will tell you that the head of gold is Babylon, the chest and arms of silver is the Medo-Persians, the torso of brass is the Greeks, and the legs of iron is the Roman Empire. And then we get down to the feet and toes, and we see the iron, which is of course Europe. Every biblical commentary will tell you that. The iron is Europe, and then it has the potter's clay. It's part potter's clay and part iron, and it says the kingdom shall be divided. And then after that comes the iron mixed with miry clay. So there are two phases down at the feet and toes, the potter's clay and the miry clay. Now the potter's clay, the Bible says plainly, and of course this is in the context of nations, the potter's clay is the house of Israel. Not the house of Judah, but the house of Israel. The house of Judah are the Jews in biblical prophecy. Who is the house of Israel? Now, if you read our booklet, The United States and Britain in Prophecy, we show you that when you look at biblical history, there are 4 whole books in the Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, that show the completely separate national histories, separate national dynasties of kings, separate national capitals of the house of Judah, the Jews, to the south with their capital at Jerusalem. And then we have, to the north, the 10-tribed house of Israel with their capital in Samaria. And the house of Israel were never known as Jews. And in fact, you look at 2 Kings 16:6, you see that the Jews, the house of Judah, are at war against Israel, the house of Israel, 2 separate nations. Then the Assyrians came in, took the house of Israel away and placed them between the Black and the Caspian Sea, and they never came back to the Promised Land. What happened to those peoples? Now, we show you in our booklet, The United States and Britain in Prophecy, that these peoples migrated up into Europe and received their birthright blessings. Ephraim became a great company a commonwealth of many nations. Manasseh became a great single powerful nation. This is the house of Israel, not the house of Judah. So here we see, down at the feet and toes, part potter's clay and part iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Obviously, this is NATO and the EU. The EU being a financial coalition, and of course, NATO being the military wing of Europe and the United States in an alliance together called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is the king of the north that we read of in Daniel, the 11th chapter, verses 40 through 45 rather. And we show you in Daniel 11:40 through 43 was fulfilled in the Gulf War that took place in 1990. And then in verse 44, it says, tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. That's the king of the north. Who is the king of the north? Who heads NATO? Who funds NATO? The United States of America. The President of the United States is the king of the north. And we prove that to you in our booklet, The Middle Eastern Prophecy. Now, Daniel 11:44 was fulfilled during the time of the War on Terror. And then it says, and he, verse 45, shall plant the tabernacles of his palace. That's military bases. And who is known for planting military bases all over the world? The United States of America. The king of the north is obviously the United States, the president of the United States. And he plants these tabernacles, these military bases, because of tidings out of the east and out of the north. And we show you that those two Hebrew words means Iran, old Persia. This is the enemy. And they're coming in to save Judah because of tidings out of the east and out of the north, because of Iran. And of course, Iran is the hidden hand behind this entire conflict between Hamas and the Israelis, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we also see Iran in Syria, in Damascus. He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace, that's military occupation, between the seas, that's the Negev desert, and of course in northern Israel, between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea, between the seas and in the glorious holy mountain. That is, of course, Jerusalem. So here we see the king of the north, NATO, coming in to save Judah from her enemies. Now when I come back, I'm going to show you this prophecy in Isaiah the 14th chapter, Isaiah the 22nd chapter, that shows basically the same thing that we read of here in Daniel, the 11th chapter, verse 45.
The mighty Roman Empire had everything. Plenty of leisure time. Their own new morality. Enormous military might. The religion of their choice. Political freedom. What went wrong? Read The Modern Romans, a 93-page lesson of history ignored. The Modern Romans asks, can we afford the grandeur of Rome?
In Isaiah the 14th chapter, verses 29 to 32, here we see a prophecy about Palestine. And God says here in verse 29, rejoice not thou, whole Palestine, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. So God says, don't rejoice, Palestine, because this rod that smote thee is broken. Now, who is this rod? It says rod, it could also read scepter. And many biblical commentaries will tell you that the rod is Judah. In Genesis 49, it talks about the scepter shall never depart from Judah. So obviously this is the house of Judah, the Jews. And in verse 30, it says here, and the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety. When you look at Zephaniah, the 2nd chapter, verse 6 through 7, it talks about the house of Judah pouring in to this Gaza Strip, and God says that they will lie down in safety and they shall be fed. So obviously this is the house of Judah. Now notice, it says, rejoice not thou, whole Palestine, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. So God says, don't rejoice because Judah is broken. So obviously Judah is going to be broken to the point where God is going to send an army from the north, verse 31, to come down and save Judah, as we shall see. So he says, rejoice not because the rod of him, that's Judah, that smote thee, and of course Judah has smitten the Palestinians many times. The rod of him that smote thee is broken. Now notice, for out of the serpent's root. Now a serpent is a symbol of an enemy. And you read that in Jeremiah, the 8th chapter, verse 17. It's a symbol of an enemy. And of course, Judah is an enemy of the Palestinians. So the serpent's root, talking about Judah, for out of the serpent's root, Judah's root. What is the root of Judah? Well, Israel. The patriarch Israel had 12 sons, 12 tribes of Israel, and this is Judah's root. And then Israel passed his name on to Ephraim and Manasseh. When you read in Genesis, the 48th chapter, Jacob said to Joseph, he crossed his hands to his two grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he said, let my name be named on them, Ephraim and Manasseh. So they wear the name Israel. And then he says that Ephraim would become a great multitude of nations, and Manasseh was to emerge as a great single powerful nation. And we have identified them in our booklet, The United States and Britain in Prophecy, as the United States and the British Commonwealth of Nations. And when you look at the history of the state of Israel has their roots in Britain and the United States. So the serpent's root, Judah's root, is Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh, the United States and the British. So he says, for out of the serpent's root, Judah's root, shall come forth a viper, a stronger enemy, a more poisonous enemy. And of course, when you look at the armies of Britain and America, they have a much stronger army than the state of Israel today. So he says, don't rejoice, a stronger army is coming, a viper, and his offspring. Now, when you look at the book of Hosea, specifically Ephraim, it talks about Ephraim and her children, mother Israel. It's talking about the colonies of Ephraim, like Canada and others. It says, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. So the colonies of Britain are going to be in this coalition as well, and they're going to have strong armies. So don't rejoice, Palestine. And then it again talks about the firstborn of the poor shall lie down, and they shall be safe. So Palestine's enemy, which is stronger than Judah, they're going to come in and they're going to save Judah, and they're going to be safe. Now notice what God says here. And I will kill thy root with famine, and he, meaning this army from the north, shall slay thy remnant, or the branches of this root. And who is this root? Who funds Hamas? Who gives them money? Who gives them weapons? Hezbollah, same thing. These are all Iranian proxy armies. The root being Iran and the branches being Hamas and Hezbollah. And God says, I will kill your root. Iran is going to be destroyed with famine, and he shall slay thy remnant, the branches of Iran. So Iran is going to be taken out of the picture by this king of the north. Now notice verse 31. Howl, O gate, cry, O city, thou whole Palestine, are dissolved, meaning dissolved in fear. Because a smoke, it says here, for there shall come from the north, the king of the north, Daniel the 11th chapter, verse 45, the king of the north comes in to Judah to save Judah, shall come from the north a smoke, which is a symbol of a huge army, and none shall be alone in his appointed times. And then it says, verse 32, and what shall one then answer the messengers of the nation? Here the Palestinians are sending ambassadors to this northern army. It says, what then shall answer the messengers of the nation? And then notice what this northern army, how this northern army answers the Palestinians. That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it. So here we see the King of the North, the President of the United States, answering the ambassadors of the Palestinians, saying that this is God's land. He gave it to the Jews, and they're here, and the King of the North is there to save Judah and protect Judah. And we give you a link to former presidents of the United States that basically say the same thing that this prophecy is saying here. So the King of the North is coming to save Judah. Isaiah, the 22nd chapter. Here we see the prophecy of the Valley of Vision, verse 1. Now here we see three prophecies in this chapter, and they all deal with Jerusalem. Verses 1 through 6 talks about the beast power that's going to attack Jerusalem. Verse 15 and on talks about the fourth overturn of the throne of David from Britain back to Jerusalem, and Jesus Christ is going to rule on that throne. And here in verse 7, here is a prophecy about an army coming in to save Judah. And this army, of course, is Israel, NATO. It says here, and it shall come to pass that thy choicest valleys shall be full of chariots, and the horsemen shall set themselves in array at the gate. And here we see in Daniel the 11th chapter, verse 45, he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and in the glorious holy mountain. Here we see this army setting their armies in the choicest valleys, and it shall be full of chariots and horsemen and so on. They're setting up military bases in Israel and occupying the state of Israel. And it says, and he, this is this army, discovered the covering of Judah. Here we see the iron dome. They call it the iron dome. God says the covering of Judah. And thou didst look in that day to the armor of the house of the forest. So he's looking at their defenses. They see that their defenses are down. Their defenses are weakened. And it says, ye have seen also the breaches of the city of David, that they are many. So they've been attacked. Jerusalem has been attacked by her enemies from without. The breaches of the city of David, that they are many, and ye have gathered together the waters of the lower pool, and ye have numbered the houses of Jerusalem, and the house have ye broken down to fortify the wall. So they're rebuilding Jerusalem. They're repairing the damage that has happened because of Iran and her proxies. They're repairing Jerusalem. So this army is coming in to save Judah, to repair Jerusalem. It's the same prophecy as Isaiah the 14th chapter. And it says, and ye have also made a ditch between the two walls for the water of the old pool. So again, they are repairing Jerusalem. And then God says here, but ye have not looked unto the maker thereof, neither had respect unto him that fashioned it long ago. Not that they don't believe in God, but they're trusting in their military for protection, and they are not trusting in God. God speaking to the Jews. They're not trusting in God, they're trusting in the military. They are trusting in NATO's protection and not God. And then in verse 12 it says, in that day did the Eternal of hosts call to weeping and to mourning and to baldness and to girding with sackcloth, and behold, joy and gladness, slaying of oxen, killing of sheep, eating flesh and drinking wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. When you read the book of Amos, chapter 6, verse 1 through 8, it is speaking of the house of Israel. And the work of the Watchman, calling for the house of Israel to repent. God's calling on Israel to repent. So obviously this army is an Israelite-led army. Of course, it's talking about NATO. And then it says, and it was revealed in my ears by the Eternal of hosts, surely this iniquity shall not be purged from you till ye die, says the Eternal of hosts. And when you read Ezekiel, the 33rd chapter, God says, turn ye from your wicked ways, for why will you die, O house of Israel? So obviously, this is talking to not just the house of Judah, but the house of Israel. We see the house of Israel in Jerusalem, saving Jerusalem, repairing Jerusalem. It is speaking of the king of the north, NATO. And so, we are going to see the state of Israel going to be broken to the point where NATO has to step in and save Judah. And when we see that, then the prophecy says that he shall come to his end and none shall help him. The end of NATO. NATO is going to break apart. Notice what it says here in Jeremiah, the 30th chapter, verse 14. It says, all thy lovers, it should read allies, all your allies have forgotten you. They seek you not. The Article 5 of the Charter of NATO. You attack one, you attack us all. Well, it looks like here that they don't believe in that Article 5 of the NATO Charter any longer. It says here that they have forgotten you. They seek you not. So NATO is going to break apart. And China is the one that's going to give NATO that deadly blow that's going to break NATO and shatter NATO, as it says here in Numbers, the 24th chapter, verse 24. It says, and the ship shall come from the coast of Kittim. Kittim we have identified in our booklet, China in Prophecy. We have identified Kittim as China. And it says, and shall afflict Asher, which is modern-day Germany. Read our booklet, Germany in Prophecy. And shall afflict Eber. Those are the Hebrew peoples, Germany, and the Hebrew peoples, the United States and Britain. They have a common enemy. Obviously, they're in alliance together. It is the EU and NATO. Shall afflict Asher and shall afflict Eber. So here we see that there's an affliction that's going to happen, a deadly blow that's going to shatter NATO. If we go back to Jeremiah, the 30th chapter, and we read the rest of that prophecy in Jeremiah 30, it says here, all your allies have forgotten you, they seek you not, for I have wounded you with the wound of an enemy, with the chastisement of a cruel one, for the multitude of thine iniquity, because your sins were increased. Why criest thou for thine affliction? There is that affliction. It says here that China is going to afflict Asher and shall afflict Eber. And God says, I have wounded you with the wound of an enemy. This deadly wound that's going to shatter NATO, where it says, all your allies have forgotten you, they seek you not. He shall come to his end, the king of the north, and none shall help him. So when we see NATO occupy the land of Judah, then we know for sure that NATO is going to come to its end. Get this free booklet, The Palestines in Bible Prophecy, and the article, Judah Shall Be Broken. Free of charge, off our website, britishisrael.ca. This is Peter Salemi saying goodbye, friends, and I'll see you here next time on the Watchman program.